Welcome to the Tank Podcast. I'm Guy Mackinnon-Little. In this episode, I'm joined by Wendy Liu, a former startup founder turned fervent critic of the tech industry, to discuss her book, Abolish Silicon Valley, out with Repeater Books. The book recounts Liu's first-hand experience of the contradictory ideology of Silicon Valley and sets out an alternative vision for how technology can become a tool for emancipation rather than capitalist extraction. So I thought one place to begin might just be, in sort of the broadest strokes possible, how would you characterize the Silicon Valley ideology as you've encountered it?
Cool. Yeah, great question. So the ideology is this idea that you can make a lot of money while making the world a better place. And in that sense, it's very similar to the Wall Street mentality that if you come up with this brilliant innovation, then you can get richer without making anyone else poor. And I think that's something that like a lot of these people not only believe but explicitly say and write about. There's this one guy, Paul Graham, who's one of the founders of Y Combinator, and he's written a lot about inequality and why inequality is good. Because if you don't have inequality, you don't have innovation, that sort of thing. And I think that's something that a lot of people in the industry do believe, at least somewhat. I certainly myself believed it. And then, beyond that, I mean, there is a grain of truth in, there is something good about the ideology of Silicon Valley, in that a key part of it is the ability to look at a system and think it doesn't have to be this way. And I think that that's what you see with like Uber, right? The idea behind Uber is, someone looked at the taxi industry and thought, well, there's a different way to get cars than just to, have the system that we have now. Now, unfortunately, that kind of disruption was not ideal, in that it was exploitative for the workers, and in the long run, it is actually not actually good for society. But I think we do need that kind of that way of viewing the world that doesn't take anything for granted and is able to envision new arrangements. And I think that that's the good part of Silicon Valley. So yeah, it's complicated because, I mean, it's really hard to boil something as big and complicated as Silicon Valley down to like a simple idea. But I think, the core of it is just the fact that there's so much money in the industry, and that the people in the industry who are recipients of that wealth have, for the most part, convinced themselves that they deserve it. And that it's partly a factor of meritocracy and the fact that, that the best rise to the top, that kind of belief. But there's also, I think, this beyond the individual level, there's like this deeper structural belief that the money that flows to Silicon Valley is earned. The people in Silicon Valley are using the money in the best possible way. And so it does make sense that tech is creating so many billionaires, because tech is just making the world so much better. So yeah, I think it's like this weird, confounding, contradictory ideology that takes into account the fact that there's so much wealth and so much inequality, while also finding a way to address people's underlying, desire for morality, and that no one wants to think they're the bad guy. I think the people in this industry, even the ones who we caricature as villains, they probably think they're the good guy at the end of the day. And so they have to find a way to, help themselves sleep at night. They have to tell themselves that the fact that they have $1 billion is better for the world.
There's something, as you rightly say, that's quite seductive about the kind of the vision of Silicon Valley and the kind of the way of seeing the world it sells. And I wonder if you could say a bit about your kind of early encounters with that, because you kind of write very clearly in the book about how even at the outset, there's some part of you that's very aware of, there's something wrong going on here. There's some kind of discomfort that can't be shaken quite so easily, but there's a willingness to kind of buy in despite that. And I think that's a really interesting way of characterizing it, where it's not necessary. I mean, it probably is the case, as you're saying, to some extent, that there's people who just kind of have the wool over their eyes and they're part of this bubble and they have their kind of own worldview. But I think for, I guess, a lot of workers involved in that industry who aren't necessarily at the very top, there's a kind of teeth clenching that kind of goes in, where you sort of attach yourself to this thing despite your sort of initial suspicions, perhaps because of some, kind of perceived greater good that you're contributing towards.
Yeah, I mean, I think what your question gets to is the question of where do norms come from? Where do people learn, what is right and wrong, what is okay and what is not okay. For me, like when I was in college and doing internships, and when I moved to San Francisco for a summer to work at Google, I was still trying to figure out like how does the world work and what is my potential place in it. And I got a lot of that feeling of discomfort just living in San Francisco and just seeing how many people were clearly struggling to get by in a city that had produced so much wealth. And there was a part of me that was always like, oh, this just feels wrong. But at the same time, I was getting conflicting messaging, right? Because all these like other institutions seemed to think it was fine. The fact that my company had produced so many billionaires and people who were celebrated in the press. They were glorified. Everyone was talking about how Google was amazing, this innovative place to work. At the time, there was very little worker dissent or even media criticism of any kind, at least not in the mainstream press. It was very hard to hear anything critical about these companies. And so, yeah, I guess I looked around and I was like, well, there's some part of me that thinks it's wrong, but maybe that part of me is just naive. Maybe there's just something I'm not getting, because I look around and all these powerful people seem to think everything's fine and that it's good that there's so much inequality. So then, when I went and did my startup, I had the same feeling of discomfort with our business model, in that our business model was really just taking people's personal data and selling it to marketers or political consultancies or whoever would pay for it. And there's a part of me that thought that's just weird. Like, that doesn't seem right. But there's another part of me that paid attention to the industry and saw the messaging. We would go to like conferences, industry conferences, and talk to investors in this space and talk to other companies. And it was very clear that this is all okay. There was this whole billion-dollar industry built on exactly what we were doing. And there was very little regulation, but also like regulation didn't seem like the important thing. The fact was that there was money in this space. And, at the time, it was very easy to mistake the presence of money for the presence of, just correctness, ethics, that it was okay because there was money in it. So, yeah, I think I guess the core of what I'm trying to say is the fact that there's money and some sort of veneer of legitimacy over Silicon Valley right now I think that makes it very hard for people to see that it could be wrong, because then, that opens the door to questioning everything. Because, the line of reasoning goes like this. It's like, well, if it was wrong, then someone powerful would have done something to stop it. And if they haven't, then maybe it's because that the entire system is broken, right? That like all of these things have to be wrong. But then once you start accepting that, that's your entire belief system. It's really, really hard to go back from that.
And how do you see that kind of ideology evolving or being put under strain as it is increasingly subject to more scrutiny with the kind of techlash and everything in the past couple of years? And I guess perhaps even more so now with the COVID-19 pandemic, where all of a sudden it does seem like there's some kind of heightened awareness of, or it just kind of makes very plain the disparities that exist within those companies. Like, can that bubble sustain that kind of friction?
Yeah, I don't think we're going to go back to the way things were. I think it takes a kind of willful ignorance to everything that's happening to still believe that the tech industry is about the greater good and not just greed. Even if it's greed cloaked in, nice lofty rhetoric, it's still very clear that there's so much of it is underpinned with greed. And I think the ideology of the industry is crumbling in a way, but in a very unequal way, in that the people on top are still going to cling onto their power and their talking points. And like the venture capitalists, the billionaires, they're not really going to change that much. But I think the people at the bottom, starting with maybe like students or those who are just entering the industry, I think they're more radical and they're more likely to be critical of the industry and treat their job as just a job. I think, the tech industry is just becoming so massive and it's expanding so much to the point where it can't only afford to hire people who are bought in to the myth. It has to hire people who also don't care. And it has been doing that for some time, which is why we've been seeing all this organizing at these companies.
But I think there's also quite an interesting vector to it where there's almost a kind of perhaps like a way in which necessity kind of can kind of like override ideology in a certain sense where, or maybe put it this way, like the way you spoke about it is as this thing goes larger and larger, its ideology goes flimsier and flimsier. But perhaps the problem with that is it's still growing larger and larger. And you now have this scenario where the world we're living in now is sort of this perfect use case for Amazon or like a number of tech companies like Zoom, or I mean, you could kind of keep adding to the list. So are there ways in which, despite that increased awareness or shared sort of dependency on these companies within this situation, it's just going to create this feedback loop, which is going to sort of usher in the tech dystopia we've all been waiting for?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, it's hard to predict what's going to happen. I think I try to stay optimistic as much as possible. Otherwise, it's just hard to get out of bed in the morning. But I'm very aware that things are not really getting better, and the most likely course of action is that things will simply get worse. Yeah, and I don't know. I think these companies are going to get bigger and more powerful, and that we are quite a ways off from having any sort of unified tech worker or just like anti-tech movement to try to change things. But at the same time, I mean, an example that I've been thinking about lately, and I don't know that much about history, so I'm not sure if this is a great example, but like I wonder what life was like in, the last few days of the Roman Empire, when the empire was huge, right? And it was just, it kind of stretched itself too thin. And I wonder if like this is kind of what it felt like, where you have, it's not just about tech either. It's like you have this kind of capitalism where the ideology is running really thin, and more people are very disillusioned by the system, and yet the system persists. How does that change? Surely there has to be a breaking point. There has to be a point where, people just like aren't bought into the system enough to keep it going. I'm not really sure how that happens, but it really doesn't feel like this can go on much longer, basically, is like the way I feel. And yeah, just especially with COVID, just the way, the fragility of capitalism before COVID is only being exacerbated by how bad things are now. And it's like, it feels so clear that, we look at what's going on, especially in the US, where unemployment is just going through the roof. People aren't paying rent. There are so many homeless people in this city who are still just on the streets. And it's hard to look at that and think, oh yeah, we can just go back to the way things were before. But yeah, I see your point that like these tech companies might just take advantage of the situation to effect a power grab and make things in a way even worse. So that's a pretty scary thought, but yeah, it's totally possible.
But hopefully not the only one. I mean, I guess that the other thing that comes with that is even if we sort of see that happening on some level, which I guess in a way we already are, that it does this other thing of kind of, okay, well, if this is the kind of environment in which the mission of these companies thrive, and they were all telling us that they were kind of setting out to be a force for good in the world and kind of connect people and improve people's lives, or, all those kind of mantras all sort of blur into one after a while, that there is a kind of like mass discrediting that sort of is, almost built into that process of their own success. There's a sort of inbuilt contradiction almost.
Yeah, for sure.
And that's maybe a good pivot to talk about. So in the spirit of getting out of this mess and not just succumbing to things getting worse, you also speak in the book very kind of ardently that it's a mistake to just kind of, there's one arm of the argument which is sort of arguing for the kind of the regulation of Silicon Valley and kind of putting constraints on that sort of like, the unbridled chaos of that industry. But there's also kind of foil to that argument, which is that technology can and should be a sort of essential part of a leftist politics. And yeah, it would be really great to kind of expand on what that consists in and why the left needs to kind of like recognize technology as a kind of essential terrain of political contestation.
Yeah, so for the first bit, my overarching point there is that technology in capitalist hands is horrible, and it's only going to extend capital's power, and it's going, at the cost of dispossessing everybody else. And so, obviously, like that's something that needs to be reined in some way through the state, through worker power, through, I don't know, some sort of user action. I'm not really sure. I think for that, I'm very open to different possibilities in terms of how to actually rein in the power of Silicon Valley. But at the same time, I do think that the answer isn't to say like, well, okay, let's just destroy all of our computers. I think we have to recognize that technology has become so crucial to modern day society, and it's buried within our infrastructure in a way where we don't even realize when we're interacting with, like an Amazon product or Google product or something. And like, if the internet were suddenly to shut off, then I think society would entirely collapse because we've all just become so dependent on things like computerized supply chains. We're in a really weird situation where, if the left can't simply say like, okay, well, let's just turn off all the computers and just go back to the way things were. There is no way things were. The world has fundamentally changed. And, I think that the best way to deal with that is to say like, well, how can we use this technology for good and, not for the purpose it's being put to now? How do we distribute power in a more egalitarian way rather than having it concentrated within a few companies, mostly based in the West Coast of the United States?
Yeah, definitely. There always seems to be this kind of Twitter beef that gets thrown up every time someone tries to sort of organize like an Amazon boycott or something, where they say, well, if you realize like how much of the internet is running on Amazon Web Services, like the kind of fallacy of that level of action would just become so kind of abundantly clear. And I'm not sure where I'd side on that debate, but I do think it sort of throws into relief this need to kind of think about those interventions on a really kind of like macro level, where you can tackle this thing as a sort of like system which is totally enmeshed into like our lives and can't really be, put back at this point.
Yeah, exactly. I think that the difficulty of truly boycotting Amazon is, this great example of the adage, there is no ethical consumption under capitalism, which, is a controversial statement. And I think it has some truth, and it's not the entire truth. But the point is like, the system that we're living in encourages, incentivizes the growth of these extremely powerful companies that, because they're so powerful, that's precisely why they're so difficult to boycott. The reason we're all talking about Amazon, the reason that there's such a desire to boycott Amazon is because we realize that it's gotten too powerful and that it needs to become less powerful. But then, of course, the flip side of it being powerful is that it is very, very difficult to avoid. And that is the same as with Google or Facebook even. And like, these companies have embedded themselves within infrastructure in a way that means there's very little that any individual consumer can do to diminish their power. It doesn't mean that there's nothing we can do, but at the same time, I think like that's an important thing for people to recognize, that individual action is not enough. It's kind of analogous to climate change in that regard, where, yes, there's something you can do as an individual, but there's still this whole host of things that can only be tackled on a systemic level. And so with Amazon, I mean, I think something that not everyone realizes is that Amazon's most profitable arm is its cloud computing division. And that powers not just like all these websites and like, things that we interact with as consumers, it also powers a lot of industry. And, Amazon has contracts with fossil fuel companies. It has contracts with police departments. Their cloud computing divisions are powering more and more of just the economy. And you can't really boycott like everything. You can't be like, I'm going to boycott the police because the police are using this Amazon technology. Well, you can't really do that. And you also, like, if you use fossil fuels, you are giving money to a company that is giving money to Amazon or Microsoft or Google. And that's something that's like also very hard to avoid. So yeah, I think what we're getting at is the level, the depth of entwinement of these companies within the rest of the system. And so to boycott Amazon means essentially to say that, we just need to dismantle capitalism. Because I at this point, I don't really see how you can separate Amazon itself from just the workings of capitalism as a whole. And, if Amazon died, then what would replace it? Would it just be another company that has the same kind of rapacious labor practices? Would it be 5 companies that are all, pretty similar to Amazon? So I think, yeah, the problems are so structural that, like, boycotts are useful for raising awareness and getting people to think about them, but like on some level, we have to do more than just boycott these companies. The boycott has to be part of a demand for something else. And I really like the calls to nationalize Amazon. I think that is a much more useful train of thought. And I think it's like nationalizing Amazon, talking about building more municipal or like public service type replacements for Amazon, giving workers at Amazon more power. All these things I think are useful for orienting us in the right direction. And consumer boycotts are only good if they're, part of this larger strategic vision to change the way that capitalism works.
To hear more podcasts from Tank, you can subscribe on all major podcast platforms or follow us on SoundCloud. The theme music for this podcast is taken from Waiting Games by Kate Simcoe and the London Electronic Orchestra.